The first time Vivian Johnson laid eyes on the man who would become her husband. She was standing on a wooden platform in Willow Creek, Colorado, the summer heat blistering her fair skin as men shouted numbers that determined her worth, numbers that amounted to less than what they'd pay for a decent horse. It was 1875, and life had dealt Vivian a series of cruel blows. At 22, she had already endured more suffering than most people twice her age. Her parents had died of cholera during their journey west from Boston 3 years prior. She had continued on with the wagon train, working as a helper to an elderly couple who had promised her shelter and employment once they reached Denver. But Mr. Thornton had passed in his sleep one night outside of Cheyenne, and Mrs. Thornton had followed him to the grave 2 days later, leaving Vivian alone in the wilderness with strangers who viewed her as nothing but another mouth to feed. She had managed to find work as a seamstress in a small town, but when the shop closed, she had wandered from place to place, taking whatever employment she could find. Her last position had been as a housekeeper for a banker in a mining town 50 miles east. When he had tried to force himself on her, she had struck him with a brass candlestick and fled into the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. 3 days later, starving and desperate, she had been caught stealing a loaf of bread from a general store in Willow Creek. The owner, a hard-faced man named Silas Graham, had given her 2 options, jail or auction. "You owe me for that bread, girl, and for the trouble you've caused," he had snarled. "Sheriff's too busy with real criminals to deal with the likes of you. Luckily for you, there's men in these parts who'll pay good money for a woman, even one as scrawny as you." So here she stood, her wrists bound with rough rope, her brown hair falling in tangled waves down her back, her blue dress torn and dirty from her desperate flight through the wilderness. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, refusing to look at the faces of the men who called out bids for her as if she were livestock. $5, called a grizzled miner with tobacco-stained teeth. $7, shouted another, a pot-bellied man old enough to be her grandfather. $10, this from a man whose face bore the scars of smallpox. $12.50, and that's my final offer, said a rancher with hands like leather and eyes that made Vivian's skin crawl. Silas Graham shook his head. "That's less than I paid for my mare last spring, and she was half lame," the crowd laughed, and Vivian closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. $25. The voice was deep and calm, cutting through the raucous bids like a knife. A hush fell over the crowd as they turned to look at the newcomer. He stood at the edge of the gathered men, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of his black Stetson. Unlike the miners and farmers who made up most of the crowd, he was dressed in clothes that, while dusty from the trail, were of good quality: a blue cotton shirt, dark vest, and denim trousers tucked into well-worn boots. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster tied down against his thigh in the way of men who knew how to use their weapons. "Did you say $25, mister?" Silas asked, unable to keep the surprise from his voice. The stranger stepped forward, and Vivian got her first clear look at his face. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 28 or 30, with sun-bronzed skin and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. His eyes were a startling blue against his tanned face, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart hammer in her chest. "I did," he said, "and I'll make it 50 if you throw in a hot meal for the lady and remove those ropes from her wrists." Silas gaped at him. $50 for her? The stranger's gaze never left Vivian's face. "That's what I said." A murmur ran through the crowd. $50 was nearly a month's wages for most of the men present. Silas recovered quickly from his shock. "Sold," he crowed, slapping his thigh in delight. "She's all yours, mister." The stranger strode forward, pulling a leather pouch from his vest pocket. He counted out $50 in coins and bills, placing them in Silas's eager palm. Then he turned to Vivian, drawing a knife from his belt. She flinched as he raised it, but he only used it to cut the ropes binding her wrists. "My name is Kieran Adams," he said quietly, his voice for her ears alone. "I own the Double A Ranch about 15 miles west of here. He hesitated, then added, "I'm not going to hurt you, Miss Johnson," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "Vivian Johnson," he nodded. "Miss Johnson, I understand you have no reason to trust me or any man right now, but I give you my word as a gentleman that no harm will come to you under my protection." Vivian studied his face, looking for signs of deceit. She had become adept at reading men's intentions during her years of struggle. What she saw in Kieran Adams's eyes was not lust or cruelty, but something she hadn't seen directed at her in a very long time: respect. "Why?" she asked, unable to stop herself. "Why would you pay so much for a stranger?" A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Because no human being should ever be sold for less than a horse." He paused, then added softly, "And because you looked like you could use an ally." Before she could respond, he turned to Silas. "About that meal you owe the lady." Silas scowled but led them to the restaurant next to his store. As they walked, Vivian was acutely aware of the curious stares following them. To these people, she was now Kieran Adams's property, bought and paid for. The thought made her stomach turn. In the restaurant, Kieran guided her to a table in the corner, positioning himself so that his back was to the wall and he had a clear view of the door, the habit of a man accustomed to watching for trouble. He ordered steak, potatoes, and coffee for both of them, then sat in silence while they waited for the food to arrive. Vivian took the opportunity to study him more closely. Despite his imposing size and the gun on his hip, there was nothing threatening about the way he held himself. His hands, resting on the table, were strong and calloused, the hands of a man who worked hard for his living. But they were clean, the nails neatly trimmed, and he wore a simple silver ring on his right hand, a band etched with a pattern of oak leaves. "Mr. Adams," she began, needing to clarify her situation. "I should make it clear that I have no intention of, that is, I won't." "Miss Johnson," he interrupted gently, "I didn't buy you for the reasons you're thinking. I have a proposition for you, but it's a business arrangement, nothing more." Some of the tension eased from her shoulders. "What kind of business arrangement?" "I need a wife." The tension returned, coiling in her stomach like a rattlesnake. "Mr. Adams," he held up a hand. "Let me explain. I need a wife in name only. My uncle left me his ranch in his will, but there's a condition: I must be married by my 30th birthday, which is 3 weeks from now, or the property goes to my cousin Richard." It's a ridiculous stipulation, but my uncle was a traditional man who believed a ranch needed a woman's touch. Vivian frowned. "So you want me to pretend to be your wife?" "Not pretend. I'm proposing a real marriage, but one of convenience only. You would have your own room, of course. All I ask is that you help maintain the house and present yourself as my wife when necessary." His eyes held her steadily. "In return, you would have a home, food, protection, and my name. After 1 year, if you wish to leave, I will give you $500, enough to start a new life wherever you choose." Vivian's mind raced. It sounded too good to be true, and in her experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually were. Why me? Why not court a respectable woman? A shadow passed over his face. "I've been away for several years. I returned only 2 months ago to claim my inheritance, and I've been too busy trying to get the ranch back in working order to socialize. Besides," he added with a wry smile that softened his serious features, "I'm not much for courting." Their food arrived, and Vivian realized how truly hungry she was. She tried to eat slowly with dignity, but it had been days since her last proper meal. Kieran pretended not to notice her eagerness, focusing on his own plate and giving her the privacy to satisfy her hunger. When she had eaten her fill, she set down her fork and looked at him directly. "Mr. Adams, I appreciate your rescue today and your generous offer. But I've learned to be cautious. How do I know I can trust you? How do I know this isn't just another trap?" He nodded, as if he had expected this question. "You don't. All I can give you is my word and the freedom to leave at any time. I won't keep you prisoner, Miss Johnson. If at any point you feel unsafe or unhappy, you may go, and I will provide you with enough money to reach the next town." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded document. "I took the liberty of having the town lawyer draw this up before I came to the auction. It outlines everything I've told you, the terms of our arrangement, your rights, and my obligations. You're welcome to read it." Vivian took the paper with trembling fingers. The legal language was dense, but the terms were exactly as he had described. It even specified that the marriage would remain unconsummated unless both parties agreed otherwise in writing. "You planned this before you even saw me," she said, looking up at him in confusion. He had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I heard about the auction from the blacksmith when I was in town this morning. I couldn't stomach the idea of it." His jaw tightened. "No one should be sold like property, Miss Johnson, not ever." She studied him for a long moment. There was something he wasn't telling her. She could sense it in the careful way he chose his words. But whatever secrets Kieran Adams harbored, she didn't sense danger from him. And the truth was, she had no better options. If she refused, where would she go? What would she do? "If I agree," she said slowly, "I want to add one condition of my own." He raised an eyebrow. "Which is, if I stay for the full year, I want to learn to read and write properly. I know the basics, but—" She hesitated, embarrassed by this admission. "I never had much schooling." To her surprise, he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face and made him look younger, almost boyish. "I think that's an excellent condition, Miss Johnson. I have quite a few books at the ranch, and I would be happy to teach you." For the first time in years, Vivian felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this strange twist of fate was not a new disaster but an unexpected blessing. "Then I accept your proposal, Mr. Adams." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Thank you, Miss Johnson." He hesitated, then added, "Under the circumstances, perhaps you should call me Kieran." "And I'm Vivian," she replied. They finished their meal in silence, each lost in thought about the unusual contract they had just entered into. When they were done, Kieran paid the bill and led her outside to where a sturdy bay gelding was hitched. "I need to make one more stop before we leave town," he said, untying the horse. "The Reverend's house is just down the street." Reality crashed over Vivian like a bucket of cold water. Of course, they would need to be married immediately for his plan to work. She was about to become Kieran Adams's wife in truth, if not in the fullest sense of the word. Reverend Thomas Whitaker was a kindly man in his 60s who greeted them warmly despite the unusual circumstances. If he was surprised by their request for an immediate wedding, he didn't show it. His wife, Martha, a plump, silver-haired woman with twinkling eyes, insisted on helping Vivian freshen up while the men discussed the particulars. "Don't you worry, dear," Martha said as she brushed Vivian's tangled hair in the privacy of her bedroom. "Kieran Adams is one of the good ones. His Uncle William was a pillar of our community, and Kieran was always a serious, responsible boy until that terrible business with his parents drove him away." Vivian's curiosity was piqued. "What happened to his parents?" Martha's hand stilled for a moment. "It's not my story to tell, dear. But I will say this: Kieran has known more than his share of sorrow. Perhaps you two can help heal each other." Before Vivian could ask more questions, Martha had finished arranging her hair and was presenting her with a simple white dress. "I wore this for my daughter's christening last spring. It should fit you well enough for the ceremony." 20 minutes later, Vivian stood before the Reverend in Martha's dress, which was indeed a good fit, while Kieran, having brushed the dust from his clothes and combed his dark hair, stood tall and solemn beside her. The only witnesses were Martha and the Reverend's son, a young man about Vivian's age who seemed amused by the whole proceeding. The ceremony was brief. Vivian's hand trembled as Kieran slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, another item he had apparently purchased before coming to the auction. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Whitaker said, closing his Bible with a smile. "You may kiss the bride." Kieran hesitated, glancing at Vivian with a question in his eyes. Understanding that appearances must be maintained, she gave a slight nod. He leaned down and brushed his lips against hers in the briefest of kisses, a mere formality. Yet Vivian felt an unexpected warmth spread through her at the gentle contact. After signing the marriage certificate and thanking the Whitakers for their assistance, Kieran helped Vivian mount his horse, then swung up behind her. As they rode out of town, Vivian was keenly aware of his solid presence at her back, his arms on either side of her as he held the reins. For better or worse, Her fate was now tied to this enigmatic man who had paid twice what any other man would give for her and called her his wife. The journey to the Double A ranch took nearly 3 hours, during which Vivian learned more about her new husband's property. The ranch had been established by his uncle William 20 years earlier and had prospered under his management. It comprised 2,000 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy main house, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, barns, corrals, and various outbuildings. "How many men work for you?" Vivian asked, trying to prepare herself for her new role. "Currently, only 4, Kieran replied. "My foreman, Ellis, who's been with the ranch since my uncle's time, and 3 cowboys, Ben, Hank, and Charlie. We lost several hands during the years the place was poorly managed." "I'm hoping to hire more once we're back on solid footing." "Poorly managed?" Vivian questioned, seizing on this new information. "I thought you said your uncle left it to you." She felt him stiffen slightly behind her. "He did, but he died 3 years ago. My cousin Richard has been running it, or rather, running it into the ground ever since. The terms of the will gave him temporary control until I returned and fulfilled the marriage condition." "And where were you all that time?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I was in Montana, working another ranch. I didn't learn of my uncle's death or the inheritance until Richard finally tracked me down 2 months ago." Vivian sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. She had her own secrets, after all, and they had only just met. There would be time enough to learn about each other in the months ahead. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, they crested a hill, and Kieran reined the horse to a stop. "There it is," he said, his deep voice rumbling against her back. "The Double A." Below them stretched a verdant valley, bisected by a silver ribbon of water that must be a creek or small river. The ranch buildings clustered near the water, the main house set slightly apart on a gentle rise. Even from this distance, Vivian could see that it was a substantial structure, 2 stories, with a wide porch wrapping around at least 2 sides. "It's beautiful," she murmured, genuinely impressed. "It is," Kieran agreed, and she heard the pride in his voice. "My uncle chose this land well. The creek never runs dry, even in the worst drought years, and the valley provides natural shelter for the herds during winter storms." They continued down the hill, and as they approached the ranch yard, a man emerged from one of the outbuildings. He was tall and lanky, with iron-gray hair and a weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the sun and wind. "That's Ellis," Kieran told her. "He was my uncle's right-hand man for 20 years. He knows more about this ranch than anyone." Ellis watched their approach with undisguised curiosity, his eyes widening when he realized Kieran wasn't alone. "Boss," he greeted as they rode up. "Didn't expect you back till tomorrow." His gaze shifted to Vivian, questions evident in his expression. Kieran dismounted, then reached up to help Vivian down. His hands were strong and steady at her waist, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. "Ellis, I'd like you to meet my wife, Vivian," Kieran said, his tone casual, as if bringing home a bride was an everyday occurrence. "We were married this afternoon in Willow Creek." Ellis's bushy eyebrows shot up toward his hairline, but to his credit, he recovered quickly. "Well now, that's a surprise and no mistake." He touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "Pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Adams. Welcome to the Double A." "Thank you, Mr. Ellis," Vivian replied, summoning a smile despite her nervousness. "Just Ellis, madam. Everyone calls me that." Kieran handed Ellis the reins. "Would you mind seeing to Sampson? I'd like to show my wife the house." "Course, boss." Ellis took the horse, giving Vivian another curious glance before leading the animal toward the barn. "He seems nice," Vivian said as Kieran guided her toward the main house. "He is. Ellis is the reason this place is still standing at all. He did his best to counter Richard's worst decisions." Kieran's jaw tightened. "I owe him a great deal." The main house was even more impressive up close. Built of sturdy logs with a stone foundation, it had clearly been constructed with both comfort and durability in mind. The wide porch held several rocking chairs and offered a sweeping view of the ranch and the mountains beyond. Kieran opened the front door and stepped aside to let Vivian enter first. The interior was surprisingly spacious and well appointed. The front door opened into a large living area with a massive stone fireplace at one end. Comfortable-looking furniture was arranged around the hearth, and bookshelves lined one wall filled, Vivian noted with pleasure, with what appeared to be hundreds of volumes. "My uncle was an avid reader," Kieran explained, following her gaze. "He had books shipped from as far away as Boston and New York." Beyond the living room was a formal dining room with a long oak table that could easily seat 12, and beyond that, a large kitchen with a cast iron stove, a pump at the sink that would bring water directly into the house, and ample counters and cupboards. "This is magnificent," Vivian said, running her hand along the smooth wooden counter. "I've never seen a ranch house like this. My uncle built it with my aunt in mind. She was from Philadelphia originally and was used to certain comforts." A shadow crossed Kieran's face. "She died of influenza the winter before I left." "I'm sorry," Vivian said softly. He nodded acknowledgement but didn't elaborate. "Let me show you upstairs." The second floor contained 4 bedrooms and, to Vivian's delight, a proper bathroom with a large copper tub. The master bedroom was at the front of the house with windows overlooking the valley. It was dominated by a massive 4-poster bed draped with quilts. "This will be your room," Kieran said, gesturing to the master bedroom. Vivian turned to him in surprise. "But it's the master bedroom." "I've been using the bedroom across the hall," he interrupted. "It was mine when I lived here as a boy. I'm comfortable there." Before she could argue, he continued down the hall, showing her the other rooms, including a small study that housed more books and a desk where, he explained, his uncle had kept the ranch accounts. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said when the tour was complete. "There are clothes in the wardrobe in your room. They belong to my aunt. You're welcome to use anything that fits. I need to speak with Ellis about tomorrow's work, but I'll be back in time for supper." With that, he left her alone in the big house, his footsteps fading as he descended the stairs and went out the front door. Vivian stood in the hallway for a long moment, overwhelmed by the sudden turn her life had taken. That morning, she had been a desperate fugitive facing auction or jail. Now she was Mrs. Kieran Adams, mistress of a substantial ranch with a wardrobe of fine clothes and a husband who treated her with unfailing courtesy. It seemed too good to be true. And in Vivian's experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. She returned to the master bedroom, her bedroom now, and opened the wardrobe. It was filled with dresses, skirts, blouses, and undergarments, all of good quality, and from what she could tell by holding them up against herself, likely to fit reasonably well. Kieran's aunt must have been close to her size. Selecting a simple blue cotton dress, Vivian took advantage of the bathroom to wash away the dust and grime of her recent ordeals. The hot water was a luxury she hadn't enjoyed in months, and she lingered in the tub until the water began to cool. Afterward, she dressed in her new clothes, combed her damp hair, and ventured downstairs to explore the kitchen. She was examining the contents of the pantry when she heard the front door open and close. Expecting Kieran, she was surprised to see a woman enter the kitchen, instead a sturdy, middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a severe bun. The woman stopped short at the sight of Vivian, her eyes widening in shock. "Who are you, and what are you doing in this house?" she demanded. Before Vivian could respond, Kieran appeared behind the woman. "Mrs. Winters, I see you've met my wife," he said calmly. The woman, Mrs. Winters, spun to face him. "Your wife? When did you get a wife?" "This afternoon," Kieran replied, moving past her to stand beside Vivian. "Mrs. Winters, this is Vivian." "Vivian, Mrs. Winters comes in from town 3 times a week to cook and clean. She's been keeping the house in order since my aunt died." Mrs. Winters looked from Kieran to Vivian and back again, her expression a mixture of disbelief and suspicion. "Well, this is certainly unexpected," she said finally. "I suppose congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Kieran said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. "What were you planning for supper tonight?" Mrs. Winters's lips tightened, but she answered the question. "Beef stew and biscuits. It'll be ready in about an hour." "Excellent. I'm going to show Vivian around the grounds before we eat." Taking Vivian's arm, he guided her out of the kitchen and through the front door. "I'm sorry about that," he said once they were outside. "Mrs. Winters is an excellent cook and housekeeper, but she can be rather formidable." "She didn't seem pleased to meet me," Vivian observed. Kieran sighed. "She's been hoping I would court her niece, Emily. The girl is sweet enough, but she's barely 18 and we have nothing in common." As they walked around the ranch, Kieran pointing out various buildings and explaining their functions, Vivian became aware of curious stares from the few ranch hands they encountered. Like Ellis, they were clearly surprised by her presence, but they were unfailingly polite, touching their hats and greeting her as Mrs. Adams. The sun was setting by the time they returned to the house, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The delicious aroma of beef stew filled the kitchen, where Mrs. Winters was just placing a basket of freshly baked biscuits on the table. "Perfect timing," she said, her tone slightly warmer than before. "Everything's ready." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters," Kieran said. "Will you join us?" The housekeeper shook her head. "No, thank you. I need to get back to town before it's fully dark." She untied her apron and hung it on a hook by the door. "I'll be back on Wednesday as usual." After she left, Kieran and Vivian sat down to their first meal together as husband and wife. The stew was delicious, rich with beef, potatoes, carrots, and onions, and the biscuits were light and fluffy. They ate in companionable silence for a while before Kieran spoke. "I should warn you that news of our marriage will spread quickly. Mrs. Winters will see to that. We should expect visitors in the coming days, neighbors curious about you." Vivian set down her spoon. "What should I tell them about how we met?" Kieran considered this. The truth would raise too many questions. "Perhaps we could say that we met when I was in town on business, and after a brief courtship, decided to marry. Won't they find it strange that no one saw us courting? People around here mind their own business for the most part. And I've been something of a recluse since returning, so my movements haven't been closely observed." He took a sip of water. "Besides, whirlwind romances aren't unheard of in these parts. Men outnumber women by quite a margin." Vivian nodded, accepting this explanation. They finished their meal, and Kieran insisted on helping her with the dishes despite her protests that she could manage. As they worked side by side at the sink, Vivian stealing glances at her new husband's profile, she found herself wondering what it would be like to be truly married to this man, not just in name, but in all ways. The thought brought a flush to her cheeks, and she turned away to hide it. Later, as they sat in the living room, Kieran reading from one of his uncle's many books while Vivian mended a tear in one of her new dresses, she broke the comfortable silence. "Kieran," she began hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" He looked up from his book. "Of course." "Why did you really come to that auction today? The truth, please." He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he closed his book and set it aside. "When I was 16, he said, his voice low and controlled, "my parents were killed by a group of men who attacked our homestead. My father was shot while defending the property. My mother—" He paused, his jaw working. "My mother was taken by the men. When her body was found 3 days later, it was clear she had suffered greatly before she died." Vivian's heart constricted with sympathy. "I'm so sorry." He acknowledged her words with a slight nod. "After their deaths, I came to live with my uncle and aunt here at the AA. But I was consumed with rage and a thirst for vengeance. When I turned 18, I left to hunt down the men responsible." "Did you find them?" Vivian asked softly. "Yes, it took me 7 years, but I found each one." His eyes, when they met hers, were haunted. "I'm not proud of the man I became during those years, Vivian. I did things that still wake me in the night." She didn't press him for details. The pain in his expression told her enough. "After it was done," he continued, "I couldn't face coming back here, facing my uncle and aunt with all that blood on my hands. So I drifted, working ranches in Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas. I didn't learn of my uncle's death until Richard tracked me down to inform me of the will's conditions. And when you heard about the auction, when I heard that a woman was being sold for less than the price of a horse, all I could think about was my mother and how she had been treated as if she were property, as if her life had no value." His hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists. I couldn't stand by and let that happen to another woman, not if I had the power to stop it. Vivian rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat. Hesitantly, she placed her hand over his clenched fist. Thank you for telling me the truth, and thank you for what you did today. His fingers slowly uncurled, turning to clasp hers gently. You don't need to thank me, Vivian. No decent man could have done otherwise. But they both knew that wasn't true. Plenty of decent men had stood in that crowd and bid pennies for her life, seeing her as nothing more than a convenient body to warm their beds and cook their meals. Kieran Adams had been different. As they sat there, hands joined, something shifted between them, a subtle change, like the first hint of spring after a long winter. They weren't just strangers bound by a contract anymore. They were two people who had each suffered, who had survived, and who now faced an uncertain future together. Later that night, as Vivian lay in the big four-poster bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, she wondered what the coming days would bring. She had a roof over her head, food in her belly, and the protection of a man who, despite his troubled past, seemed honorable and kind. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship, not yet. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, Vivian allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, her story might have a happy ending after all. The first light of dawn was filtering through the bedroom curtains when Vivian awoke the next morning. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The soft mattress and clean sheets were a far cry from the hard ground or shabby boarding houses she had grown accustomed to. Then memory returned in a rush. The auction, Kieran's unexpected intervention, their hasty marriage, the ranch. She rose and dressed quickly in a simple calico dress she had found in the wardrobe, then made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, but the front door stood slightly ajar, and through it she could see Kieran on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. As he surveyed his domain in the early morning light, he turned at the sound of her footsteps. "Good morning," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," she admitted, joining him at the porch railing. "The bed is very comfortable." He offered her his coffee cup, and she took a sip, grateful for the strong, hot brew. "I've been up since before dawn," he told her. "We're moving part of the herd to the north pasture today. I'll be gone most of the day." Vivian nodded, already thinking about how she would spend her time. "I'll see what needs to be done in the house. Mrs. Winters seems to keep things clean, but I noticed the pantry could use organizing, and there are some linens that need mending." Kieran looked pleased by her initiative. "The house is yours to manage as you see fit. If you need anything, Ellis's wife, Sarah, lives in the small cabin just past the corral. She's a kind woman. I think you'll like her." After a simple breakfast of eggs and bacon, which Vivian insisted on cooking despite Kieran's protests that he could fend for himself, he departed with his men, and Vivian set to work. She spent the morning exploring every corner of the house, taking inventory of supplies, and making a list of things that needed attention. Around midday, a knock at the door interrupted her work. Opening it, she found a small, plump woman with a friendly face and graying auburn hair pulled back in a bun. "You must be Vivian," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Sarah, Ellis's wife. I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought you might like some company for lunch." Vivian welcomed her in, grateful for the friendly overture. Sarah had brought a basket containing fresh bread, cheese, and apple tarts, and the two women sat at the kitchen table, sharing the meal and getting to know each other. "I've been on the double for nearly 20 years, Sarah told her. "Ellis and I came with Mr. William Kieran's uncle when he first bought the place. It wasn't much back then, just a tumble-down cabin and a few head of cattle. But Mr. William had vision, and he worked harder than any three men put together." "Kieran seems very fond of his uncle," Vivian observed. Sarah nodded. "William was a good man. He practically raised that boy after what happened to his parents." She shook her head sadly. "Such a terrible thing. Kieran was never the same afterward, always a serious child, but after that, it was like something inside him just closed up tight." "He told me a little about it," Vivian said, not wanting to reveal too much of what Kieran had shared in confidence. "Did he now?" Sarah looked surprised. He must trust you a great deal. Kieran doesn't talk about his past with just anyone. She studied Vivian with new interest. Ellis told me how suddenly you two married. I'll admit, we were all shocked. Kieran's kept to himself since coming back, barely speaking to anyone beyond what's necessary for ranch business. Vivian tensed, wondering what else Ellis had told his wife, but Sarah's next words reassured her. I'm glad he's found someone, the older woman continued. That boy's been alone too long. Everyone needs someone to share their burdens with. After lunch, Sarah insisted on helping Vivian with the household tasks she had planned for the afternoon. As they worked side by side, mending linens and organizing kitchen cupboards, Sarah shared stories about the ranch and its history, filling in gaps in Vivian's knowledge about her new home. The creek that runs through the property never runs dry, Sarah explained as they folded freshly mended sheets. Even in the worst drought years, there's always water for the cattle. That's what made this land so valuable. Mr. William knew what he was doing when he bought it. Kieran mentioned that his cousin Richard has been managing the ranch since his uncle died, Vivian said, carefully broaching the subject. He implied that Richard hasn't done a very good job. Sarah's lips tightened. That's putting it mildly. Richard Hayes is a gambler and a drunk. He sold off nearly half the herd to pay his debts and let most of the good hands go because he was too cheap to pay them properly. If Kieran hadn't come back when he did, there might not have been a ranch left to save. Why would Mr. William leave such an important condition in his will? About Kieran needing to be married, Sarah smiled sadly. Mr. William worried about Kieran. He knew the boy was out there somewhere, still hunting down those men who killed his parents. He feared that vengeance was all Kieran lived for, and that once it was done, he might have nothing left to live for at all. I think he hoped that by requiring marriage he could force Kieran to build a life, to think about the future instead of dwelling in the past. Vivian considered this. It seems a strange way to go about it. William Adams was a good man, but he could be stubborn and set in his ways. He believed a man needed roots to thrive, land, a home, a family. Sarah shrugged. Whether his method was right or wrong, it worked. Kieran is here, he's working the land, and he's married. That's more than any of us expected 6 months ago. By late afternoon, the house was in perfect order, and Sarah took her leave, promising to return soon. Alone again, Vivian decided to prepare a proper dinner for Kieran and herself. The pantry was well stocked, and she set about making a meal that would be ready when he returned from his day's work. The sun was setting when she heard the sound of horses in the yard. Looking out the window, she saw Kieran and his men returning, dusty and tired from their day of moving cattle. She watched as Kieran dismounted and spoke briefly with Ellis, before handing off his horse and turning toward the house. When he entered, the aroma of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread filled the air. He paused in the doorway, a look of surprise on his face. Something smells wonderful, he said, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. Dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes, Vivian told him. There's hot water for washing up. He looked at her for a long moment, an unreadable expression in his blue eyes. Thank you, he said finally. I can't remember the last time I came home to a hot meal that I didn't have to cook myself. While he went to clean up, Vivian set the table, using the good dishes she had found in the dining room cabinet. When Kieran returned, his hair damp from washing and wearing a clean shirt, they sat down to eat. This is delicious, he said after his first bite of chicken. Where did you learn to cook like this? My mother taught me the basics, Vivian replied, and I worked in a few kitchens over the years. You pick things up. They ate in companionable silence for a while before Kieran spoke again. I met with the banker in town yesterday before the auction. He says the ranch is solvent, but barely. Richard left us with substantial debts, and will need a good calving season this spring to get back on solid ground. Vivian appreciated that he said we and us, including her in the ranch's future, even though their marriage was, at its core, a business arrangement. Is there anything I can do to help? She asked. Besides keeping the house in order, Kieran considered this. Can you ride? Yes, she said. Not well, but I can stay on a horse. That's a start. There's plenty you could help with if you're willing to learn. And having you manage the household accounts would be a tremendous help. My uncle kept meticulous records, but since his death, the books have been neglected. I'd be happy to try, Vivian said, though she wondered if her limited education would be up to the task. As if reading her thoughts, Kieran added, I haven't forgotten my promise to help you improve your reading and writing. We could start tonight if you'd like. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Kieran selected a book from the shelves, a collection of short stories by Washington Irving. They sat side by side on the sofa as he opened to Rip Van Winkle and handed the book to Vivian. Read as much as you can, he encouraged. Don't worry about mistakes. I'll help when you need it. Vivian began to read aloud, stumbling over some of the more difficult words but managing better than she had expected. Kieran was a patient teacher, gently correcting her pronunciation and explaining unfamiliar terms without making her feel ignorant or inadequate. They spent an hour this way, and by the end, Vivian felt a sense of accomplishment that she hadn't experienced in years. As she closed the book, her fingers brushed against Kieran's, and she felt that same warmth she had experienced when he had taken her hand the night before. Thank you, she said softly, for keeping your promise. I always keep my promises, Vivian, he replied, his voice equally quiet. Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, something electric passed between them. Then Kieran stood, breaking the spell. It's getting late, he said, and tomorrow will be another long day. Good night, Vivian. Good night, Kieran, she replied, watching as he left the room, wondering about the strange feeling of disappointment that settled in her chest as he disappeared up the stairs. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Kieran would rise before dawn and begin his day's work, returning at sunset to a hot meal prepared by Vivian. In the evenings, they would sit together in the living room, sometimes reading, sometimes talking about the day's events, and always ending with a lesson to improve Vivian's reading and writing skills. True to Sarah's prediction, they received several visitors, neighboring ranchers and their wives, curious about Kieran's new bride. Vivian played her part well, sharing the story they had agreed upon about their whirlwind courtship and answering questions about her background with carefully crafted half-truths. I was working as a seamstress in Denver when we met, she would say, a story close enough to the truth to be comfortable. My parents died during the journey west from Boston several years ago. If anyone was suspicious of the hasty marriage, they kept their doubts to themselves. Most seemed genuinely pleased that Kieran had settled down and that the double would remain in Adam's hands. Mrs. Winters continued to come 3 days a week, though her role had shifted from housekeeper to assistant, as Vivian had firmly established herself as mistress of the house. The older woman had grudgingly accepted the situation, though she still occasionally made comments about her niece Emily that Vivian chose to ignore. As April turned to May, the weather warmed and the ranch became a hive of activity. The calving season was in full swing, and every hand was needed to ensure the safe delivery of the new additions to the herd. Kieran often came home exhausted, sometimes falling asleep in his chair before he could finish his dinner. One such evening, as Vivian gently shook him awake to suggest he go upstairs to bed, he caught her hand in his. You've been a blessing, Vivian, he said, his voice rough with fatigue. I don't know how I would have managed this season without you. The sincerity in his eyes made her heart flutter. I'm glad I can help, she replied, suddenly acutely aware of his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. It's more than help, he insisted. You've made this house a home again. I hadn't realized how much I missed that until you came. Before she could respond, he released her hand and stood, stretching his tired muscles. I should get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. As he headed upstairs, Vivian remained in the living room, pondering his words. Something was changing between them, something subtle but undeniable. The lines of their business arrangement were beginning to blur, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. On one hand, she had grown to respect and admire Kieran. He was hardworking, honest, and kind not just to her, but to everyone around him. He treated his ranch hands fairly, took time to listen to their concerns, and never asked anyone to do something he wasn't willing to do himself. He was patient with her lessons, never making her feel inferior despite her limited education, and he genuinely seemed to value her contributions to the household. On the other hand, she was all too aware that their marriage had an expiration date. In less than a year, she would be free to leave with enough money to start a new life elsewhere. That had been the plan, the arrangement they had agreed upon. Developing deeper feelings for Kieran would only complicate matters and lead to heartache when the time came to part ways. Yet as the days passed, Vivian found it increasingly difficult to maintain emotional distance. There was something about Kieran Adams that drew her in, perhaps his quiet strength, or the glimpses of vulnerability she occasionally saw beneath his composed exterior, or the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face and made her heart race. One afternoon in late May, Vivian was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she heard a commotion in the yard. Looking out the window, she saw a group of riders approaching 5 men led by someone on a flashy black stallion. They weren't ranch hands, and something about their demeanor set alarm bells ringing in her mind. She stepped onto the porch just as the riders reached the house. The man on the black stallion was in his early 30s, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with dark hair slicked back from a high forehead and eyes that reminded her of a rattlesnake's, cold and calculating. "Well, well," he drawled, looking Vivian up and down in a way that made her skin crawl. "You must be the new Mrs. Adams, Richard Hayes, at your service." He swept off his hat in a mocking bow. "Kieran's dear cousin." So this was Richard, the man who had nearly run the double into the ground, the man who would inherit if Kieran failed to meet the will's conditions. Vivian straightened her spine and lifted her chin. "Mr. Hayes," she acknowledged coolly, "Kieran isn't here at the moment, he's out with the herd." Richard dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to one of his companions. "That's quite all right, Mrs. Adams, I didn't come to see Kieran." "I came to see you." He ascended the porch steps, stopping uncomfortably close to her. "I must say, Cousin Kieran has surprised me. When I heard he'd married, I expected some rough frontier woman or a desperate spinster, but you—" His eyes raked over her again. "You're quite the prize." Vivian took a step back, maintaining her composure with effort. "What do you want, Mr. Hayes?" He smiled, a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Just to welcome you to the family, of course, and to see for myself this mysterious bride Kieran acquired so suddenly." He reached out to touch a strand of her hair and she jerked away. "How did you two meet, I wonder? Kieran's never been one for socializing." "That's between my husband and me," Vivian replied firmly. Richard's smile hardened. "Is it? I find the timing rather convenient." The deadline in the will approaching, and suddenly Kieran produces a wife out of thin air. He leaned closer. One might almost suspect some kind of arrangement. Vivian's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Hayes, but I suggest you leave before my husband returns. He won't be pleased to find you harassing me." Richard laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Harassing? I'm having a pleasant conversation with my new cousin-in-law." His voice dropped to a menacing purr. "But I'm curious what would happen if word got out that this marriage is a sham, that Kieran Adams bought himself a wife to secure his inheritance." Ice flooded Vivian's veins. How could he possibly know? "You're talking nonsense," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Kieran and I married for love, as people do." "Did you?" Richard reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Then perhaps you can explain this." He unfolded the paper and held it up for her to see. With a sinking heart, Vivian recognized it as a copy of the contract Kieran had shown her in the restaurant in Willow Creek, the document outlining the terms of their arrangement. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Let's just say I have friends in useful places," Richard replied smugly. "Including the lawyer's office in Willow Creek." Imagine my surprise when I learned that my cousin had commissioned a contract for a marriage of convenience, just days before the deadline in my uncle's will. Vivian's mind raced. The contract alone wasn't proof that their marriage was invalid. They had been legally wed by Reverend Whittaker, with witnesses present. But if Richard could convince a judge that the marriage was entered into fraudulently, solely to circumvent the will's conditions. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Richard's smile widened. Now we're getting somewhere. It's simple, really. I want what's rightfully mine, this ranch. My uncle had no right to leave it to Kieran with such ridiculous conditions. His eyes hardened. Kieran abandoned this place years ago. He left my uncle and aunt to manage alone while he gallivanted around the territories playing vigilante. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who took care of things after they died. By selling off half the herd and running up debts, Vivian couldn't help retorting. Richard's face darkened with anger. Watch your tongue, woman. You're in no position to judge me. He tapped the contract against his palm. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave tonight. Pack your things and go. I'll even give you money for your trouble, more than Kieran promised you in this pathetic contract. And if I refuse, then I'll take this to a judge, along with testimony about how you were literally purchased at auction, and we'll see how long your marriage stands up to legal scrutiny. He shrugged. Of course that would mean scandal for you. Your reputation would be ruined. No decent man would have you after that. Vivian's hands curled into fists at her sides. You're despicable. I'm practical, Richard corrected. And I'm offering you a way out that benefits us both. Take the money and disappear. Start a new life somewhere far from here. Isn't that what you wanted anyway? According to this contract, you never intended to stay beyond a year. Before Vivian could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. Kieran was riding hard toward the house, his face set in grim lines as he spotted Richard on the porch. Richard quickly folded the contract and returned it to his pocket. Think about my offer, he murmured. I'll be at the Silver Dollar in town for the next 3 days. After that, I take this to a judge. He stepped back as Kieran dismounted and strode toward them, his expression thunderous. Richard, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. What are you doing here? Richard spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. Just paying a social call, cousin. Getting to know your lovely bride. He donned his hat and tipped it to Vivian. Mrs. Adams, it's been a pleasure. I'm sure we'll meet again soon. With that, he descended the porch steps, remounted his horse, and led his men away, leaving Vivian and Kieran standing in tense silence. Are you all right? Kieran asked as soon as Richard was out of earshot. Did he threaten you? Vivian wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm spring air. He knows, Kieran, about our arrangement. He has a copy of the contract. Kieran's face paled. That's impossible. The only copies were with the lawyer and... He trailed off, realization dawning. Silas Graham, he must have gone to Silas. He wants me to leave, Vivian continued. Tonight, he says if I don't, he'll take the contract to a judge and challenge the validity of our marriage. Kieran's jaw tightened. He's bluffing. The marriage is legal regardless of the circumstances that brought it about. But if a judge believes it was entered into fraudulently, specifically to circumvent the will's conditions, it doesn't matter, Kieran insisted. The will only specified that I had to be married by my 30th birthday. It didn't say anything about the reason for the marriage or how long it had to last. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Richard is desperate. He's probably in debt again and needs the ranch to save himself. Vivian hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering her since Richard's arrival. Is it true what he said, about you abandoning your uncle and aunt to play vigilante? Kieran's expression clouded. I didn't abandon them. Uncle William knew why I left. He understood my need for closure. He sighed heavily. But yes, I was gone for years. I should have come back sooner. I should have been here when they needed me. The guilt in his voice was palpable, and Vivian's heart ached for him. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. You can't change the past, Kieran. All you can do is make the best of the present. He covered her hand with his own, his touch warm and reassuring. We won't let Richard win, Vivian, I promise you that. As they stood there on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ranch yard, Vivian realized with sudden clarity that she didn't want to leave, not in 3 days, not in a year. Somehow, against all odds, this place had become home, and Kieran had become far more than just the man who had rescued her from a desperate situation. The question was, did he feel the same way? Or was she still just a means to an end, a necessary component in securing his inheritance? Kieran spent a restless night pacing the floor of his bedroom, his mind racing with thoughts of Richard's threats and what they might mean for Vivian and the ranch. By dawn, he had made a decision. After a hasty breakfast, he rode into town, leaving Vivian with instructions to stay close to the house and to send for Ellis if Richard or his men returned. The lawyer's office in Willow Creek was located above the general store, a small, tidy space that smelled of paper and pipe tobacco. Gerald Watkins, the town's only attorney, was a portly man in his 50s with spectacles that constantly slid down his nose and a reputation for discretion. "Mr. Adams," he greeted Kieran, rising from behind his desk. "What brings you to town so early?" Kieran got straight to the point. "Mr. Watkins, did you or anyone in your office provide a copy of my marriage contract to Richard Hayes?" The lawyer's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Certainly not. That would be a breach of confidentiality. I take my professional ethics very seriously, Mr. Adams." "Then how did Richard get his hands on a copy?" Kieran demanded. Watkins frowned, pushing his spectacles back up his nose. "I have no idea. The only copies were the one I gave to you and the one I keep in my files." He moved to a large cabinet and pulled open a drawer, rifling through the papers inside. After a moment, his frown deepened. "That's odd. My copy seems to be missing or stolen." The lawyer looked uncomfortable. "I suppose it's possible someone could have accessed my files without my knowledge. I don't always lock the office when I step out for lunch or to visit the necessary." Kieran bit back a curse. It would be just like Richard to sneak into the lawyer's office and rifle through his papers. But how had he known to look for such a document in the first place? "Mr. Watkins, I need your legal opinion. If Richard were to take this contract to a judge and claim that my marriage is fraudulent, specifically entered into to meet the conditions of my uncle's will, would he have a case?" The lawyer stroked his chin thoughtfully. "It's a complex question. The marriage itself is legally binding, performed by an ordained minister with proper witnesses and documentation. The fact that you and Mrs. Adams had a prior agreement regarding the nature of your union doesn't invalidate the marriage itself. But could it invalidate my claim to the ranch under the terms of the will? That's where things get murky," Watkins admitted. "Your uncle's will specified that you must be married by your 30th birthday to inherit. It didn't specify anything about the nature of the marriage or how it came about. However, a particularly strict judge might interpret the spirit of the will rather than just the letter, and if they believed you had married solely to circumvent your uncle's intentions." Kieran's heart sank. It was exactly as he had feared. "Is there anything I can do to protect my claim?" he asked. Watkins adjusted his spectacles again. "The simplest solution would be if your marriage were demonstrably real, not just a legal arrangement, but a genuine union. If you and Mrs. Adams are living as husband and wife in all respects, sharing a life together with the intention of building a future, it would be much harder for Richard to challenge the validity of your marriage as it pertains to the will." Kieran left the lawyer's office with a heavy heart. The solution Watkins proposed was simple in theory, but complicated in practice. He and Vivian had a contract, an agreement with clear terms. He had promised her that their marriage would be in name only, that she would be free to leave after a year with enough money to start a new life. To suggest changing those terms now, when she was essentially trapped by Richard's threats, seemed deeply unfair. Yet, as he rode back to the ranch, Kieran found himself wondering if such a change would be entirely unwelcome. Over the past weeks, his feelings for Vivian had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated. He admired her resilience, her quick mind, her willingness to work hard and learn new skills. He enjoyed their evening conversations and the comfortable routine they had established. He looked forward to coming home to her at the end of each day. Was it possible that what had begun as a business arrangement could become something more, something real? When he arrived back at the ranch, he found Vivian in the garden behind the house, planting vegetable seeds in the rich, dark soil. She looked up at his approach, shading her eyes against the midday sun and the sight of her hair tied back with a blue ribbon. Cheeks flushed with exertion, a smudge of dirt on her nose made his heart skip a beat. How did it go in town? she asked, rising to her feet and brushing soil from her hands. Not well, he admitted. Watkins claims he didn't give Richard the contract, but his copy is mysteriously missing from his files, and his legal opinion is concerning. He explained what the lawyer had told him, watching Vivian's expression carefully as he did so. She listened without interruption, her blue eyes thoughtful. So, she said when he had finished, the solution is to convince a judge that our marriage is real not just on paper, but in practice. That's what Watkins suggests, Kieran confirmed. But Vivian, I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to change the terms of our agreement. If you want to stick to the original plan, I'll find another way to deal with Richard. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the garden tools in her hands. And if I don't want to stick to the original plan? She asked softly. Kieran's heart thundered in his chest. What do you mean? Vivian set the tools aside and met his eyes squarely. I mean that people change, Kieran. Circumstances change. When we made our agreement, we were strangers. Now, she hesitated, a flush creeping up her neck. Now we're not. He took a step toward her, hardly daring to hope. Vivian, are you saying? I'm saying that I care about you, she continued, her voice gaining strength. More than I expected to, more than is probably wise given our arrangement, but there it is. She lifted her chin defiantly, and I hope that you might feel something for me too. Kieran closed the distance between them in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. I do, he said, his voice rough with emotion. God help me, Vivian, I've been falling in love with you since the moment you agreed to become my wife. The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that changed everything. Vivian's eyes widened, and for a terrible moment, Kieran feared he had misunderstood, that he had ruined the fragile connection between them with his presumption. Then she smiled, a radiant, joyful smile that transformed her face and rose on her tiptoes to press her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle exploration, but it quickly deepened as months of unacknowledged desire surged between them. Kieran's arms slid around Vivian's waist, drawing her closer, while her hands moved to his shoulders, then up to tangle in his hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. I never expected this, he murmured. When I went to that auction, I was only thinking of saving you from a terrible situation. I never imagined you would end up saving me too. Vivian's fingers traced the line of his jaw, her touch feather light. We saved each other, I think. That evening, they sat on the porch swing as the sun set, Vivian nestled against Kieran's side, his arm around her shoulders. They had spent the afternoon truly talking, in a way they never had before, sharing hopes and fears, dreams and regrets. I never told you why I was running when I was caught stealing that bread, Vivian said, her head resting on his shoulder. The banker I worked for in Silver Creek, he tried to force himself on me. When I fought back, I hit him with a candlestick. Hard, I ran because I was afraid I'd killed him. Kieran's arm tightened around her. If he had died, it would have been self-defense. Perhaps, she acknowledged, but who would believe a penniless housekeeper over a respected banker? I panicked and ran, she sighed. I've been running for so long, Kieran, from one bad situation to another. Until you, he pressed a kiss to her hair, you never have to run again, Vivian, not if you don't want to. I don't want to, she said simply. I want to stay here with you. I want to help you build something lasting. I want. She hesitated, then continued in a whisper, I want to be your wife. Your real wife? Later that night, Kieran stood outside Vivian's bedroom door, the master bedroom that had been his uncle's, then briefly Richard's, and now hers. He had never entered it since giving it to her on their first night at the ranch. Now he raised his hand and knocked softly. She opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for him. She had changed into a white cotton nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders, and the sight of her made his breath catch. May I come in? He asked, his voice husky. In answer, she stepped back, opening the door wider. Kieran entered, closing the door behind him, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a boy. Vivian, he began, I want you to know that we can take this slowly. Just because we've acknowledged our feelings doesn't mean we have to, she silenced him with a finger to his lips. Kieran Adams, she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, Are you trying to talk your way out of consummating our marriage?" He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Never. I just don't want you to feel rushed or pressured." "I don't," she assured him, stepping closer. "I want this. I want you." Any further protests died on his lips as Vivian rose on her toes to kiss him. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a mutual hunger that had been building since the moment they met. As clothing was discarded and they fell together onto the bed, Kieran marveled at the twist of fate that had brought this extraordinary woman into his life. What had begun as an act of compassion, a rescue from a desperate situation, had somehow transformed into the greatest blessing of his life. And as they moved together in the darkness, learning each other's bodies with tender exploration and mounting passion, Kieran silently thanked his uncle for the condition that had seemed so arbitrary and frustrating just months ago. William Adams had been right. After all, a man needed more than land and cattle to truly live. He needed love. He needed a home. He needed Vivian. Richard Hayes returned to the double 3 days later, as promised. He rode alone this time, his confidence evident in the casual way he dismounted and approached the house, as if he already owned it. Kieran and Vivian were waiting for him on the porch, standing side by side, their hands clasped between them. The past 3 days had been a revelation for both of them, a honeymoon of sorts, filled with passion and laughter and deep, honest conversations about their pasts and their hopes for the future. "Well, well," Richard drawled as he climbed the porch steps. "Still here, Mrs. Adams, I'm surprised." "This is my home, Mr. Hayes," Vivian replied calmly. "Why would I leave it?" Richard's smirk faltered slightly at her composed demeanor. He had clearly expected to find her gone or, at the very least, cowed by his threats. "I see my cousin has convinced you to stand your ground," he said, his tone hardening. "A mistake, I'm afraid. I have the proof I need to challenge this sham of a marriage, and once I do, you'll both be out on your—" "I wouldn't be so sure of that, Richard," Kieran interrupted. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded document identical to the one Richard had shown Vivian days earlier. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" "A copy of our original contract," Kieran replied. "The one you stole from Watkins's office." "I don't know what you're talking about," Richard blustered. "I found that contract through perfectly legal—" "Save it," Kieran cut him off. "It doesn't matter how you got it. What matters is that it's now null and void." He held the contract over the railing of the porch, where a small fire was burning in a metal bucket. With deliberate slowness, he let the paper drop into the flames. Richard watched in disbelief as the document curled and blackened. "That doesn't change anything. I still have my copy." "Which is now the only copy in existence," Kieran pointed out, "your word against ours. And I think you'll find that the word of a respected rancher and his wife carries more weight than that of a known gambler and debtor." Richard's face flushed with anger. "This isn't over, Kieran. I'll still take this to a judge. I'll still prove that you married this woman just to secure the inheritance." "You're welcome to try," Kieran said evenly. "But I should warn you, any judge will want to examine the nature of our marriage as it exists now, not just the circumstances of how it began. And I think you'll find that Vivian and I have a genuine, loving marriage that more than fulfills the spirit of my uncle's will." As if to emphasize his point, Kieran slipped his arm around Vivian's waist, drawing her closer to his side. She leaned into him naturally, the gesture one of comfortable intimacy rather than calculated display. Richard's gaze darted between them, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "You expect me to believe you've actually fallen in love in just a few weeks?" "I don't particularly care what you believe, Richard," Kieran replied, "but yes, I love my wife. And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it to her." Vivian looked up at Kieran, her heart full to bursting with the simple truth of his words. "And I love my husband," she said, loudly enough for Richard to hear but with her eyes fixed on Kieran's. "More than I ever thought possible." Richard made a disgusted noise. "This is absurd. You can't expect anyone to believe this charade." "It's not a charade," Vivian said, finally turning to face Richard directly. "But even if it were, it would be a more honorable path than the one you've chosen." Threatening a woman, stealing legal documents, trying to cheat your own family out of their rightful inheritance, you should be ashamed, Mr. Hayes. Richard's face darkened with rage. You dare to lecture me on honor, you who were sold like cattle in a public auction. Who agreed to marry a stranger for money? That's enough. Kieran's voice cracked like a whip. He took a step toward his cousin, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You will not speak to my wife that way, not ever. For a moment, the two men stood toe to toe, tension crackling between them like heat lightning before a storm. Then, surprisingly, it was Richard who backed down. Fine, he said, adjusting his hat with a show of nonchalance that didn't quite mask his unease. Play house with your purchased bride, Kieran. Pretend all you want, but this isn't over. Yes, Richard, it is, Kieran said firmly. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of, and if I ever see you on my property again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Richard's lips twisted in a sneer, but he offered no further argument. With a final contemptuous glance at Vivian, he turned and descended the porch steps, mounted his horse, and rode away without looking back. Kieran and Vivian stood in silence until the dust from Richard's departure had settled. Then Kieran turned to her, concern etched on his features. Are you all right? He asked softly. Vivian nodded, leaning into his embrace. I'm fine. Do you think he'll really go to a judge? Kieran sighed, resting his chin on top of her head. I don't know. He might try, but I meant what I said, his word against ours, and without the contract as evidence, he has very little to back up his claims. Besides, he pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. I also meant what I said about loving you. Our marriage may have started as an arrangement, but it's become something real, something true. Vivian raised a hand to his cheek, her heart full. I know, I feel it too. As they stood there on the porch of the home they now truly shared, the future stretching before them like the vast, promising landscape of the Double-A, Vivian marveled at the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this moment. She had been sold for less than the price of a horse, a final humiliation in a life filled with hardship. But Kieran Adams had paid double her price and called her his wife not as an act of charity or convenience, but as the beginning of a love story neither of them had seen coming. And as his lips met hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of happiness to come, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that some things, once broken, could be mended. Some wounds, once healed, could make you stronger. And some journeys, no matter how difficult, could lead you exactly where you were meant to be. 5 years later, Vivian stood on the porch of the Double-A ranch house, watching as Kieran taught their 3-year-old son, William, to sit on a gentle pony. The little boy's delighted laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the sounds of ranch life, the lowing of cattle, the whinnying of horses, the distant calls of cowboys as they went about their daily tasks. The Double-A had prospered beyond their wildest expectations in the years since their marriage. The herds had doubled in size, the ranch hands had increased to 15, and they had even added a small apple orchard on the southern edge of the property, Vivian's special project, which was now beginning to bear fruit. Richard Hayes had indeed gone to a judge with his accusations, but without the contract as evidence, and faced with the obvious devotion between Kieran and Vivian, his case had been dismissed. He had left Colorado shortly thereafter, rumored to have headed to California to try his luck in the gold fields. They hadn't heard from him since. As Vivian watched her husband and son, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly where their second child grew, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. She was no longer the desperate young woman who had been sold on an auction block for less than the price of a horse. She was Vivian Adams, beloved wife, mother, and respected mistress of one of the finest ranches in Colorado. She could read and write with confidence now, and she kept the ranch accounts with meticulous precision. She had friends in the community, a garden that was the envy of neighboring ranchers' wives, and a husband who looked at her each day as if she were the greatest treasure he had ever found. Kieran glanced up, catching her eye across the yard, and smiled that rare, transformative smile that still made her heart skip a beat. He lifted William from the pony and set him on his shoulders, then walked toward the house, the little boy squealing with delight at his elevated position. "Mama, did you see?" William called as they approached. "I rode all by myself, I saw, sweetheart," Vivian replied, reaching up to ruffle his dark hair so like his father's. "You were very brave." Kieran set William down on the porch, and the boy immediately ran inside, eager to tell Sarah, who had become something of a grandmother to him, about his adventure. "How are you feeling?" Kieran asked, his hand gently covering Vivian's where it rested on her belly. "Wonderful," she replied truthfully. "Dr. Matthews says everything is progressing perfectly. Another month and we'll have a new member of the family." Kieran's eyes softened as he looked at her. "Have I told you today how much I love you?" Vivian pretended to consider this. Let me think. "Yes, when you brought me breakfast in bed this morning, and again when you left for the north pasture. And in the note you sent back with Charlie when you realized you'd be gone through lunch." She smiled up at him. "But I wouldn't mind hearing it again." He laughed and pulled her into his arms, careful of her pregnant belly. "I love you, Vivian Adams, more today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." She stretched up to kiss him, savoring the familiar taste of his lips, the solid strength of his arms around her. "And I love you, Kieran Adams, for rescuing me when I needed it most, and for building this beautiful life with me." As they stood together on the porch of their home, the setting sun painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, Vivian thought about the strange arithmetic of her life, how she had once been valued at less than a horse, only to find herself cherished beyond measure by a man who had seen her worth when no one else did. Some might call it luck or fate or divine intervention. Vivian simply called it love, a love born in the most unlikely circumstances, tested by adversity, and stronger for having weathered the storms together. And as Kieran led her inside to join their son for dinner, his hand warm and steady in hers, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that this was where she belonged. Not because she had been bought and paid for, but because she had chosen this life, this man, this love freely and with her whole heart. In the wild, untamed beauty of the Colorado frontier, Vivian Adams had found not just shelter or security, but a home in the truest sense of the word. And that, she reflected as Kieran's arms encircled her from behind, his hands resting protectively over the new life growing within her, was a treasure beyond price.